Hello and thank you for joining us. I'm Ed Hand, your host for tonight's Unpublished TV panel discussion. Our topic tonight, again, focusing on foreign affairs and the fractured relationship between Canada and China. However you're watching and listening to our show, whether through our social media channels on Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube, or our podcast channels, iTunes, Google Play, Spotify, iHeartRadio, and more, I'd like to remind you can still cast your vote on this topic at unpublished.vote and then email your MP to tell them why. Our question this week is, if the accusations were true, should Canada scale back on its trade relationship with China? At unpublished.vote, you will find our podcast on this issue, as well as articles, opinion pieces, and research on the fractured relationship. So let's get started. Joining us tonight, Charles Burton, Senior Fellow at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute Centre for Advancing Canada's Interests Abroad and former counselor at the Canadian Embassy in Beijing. Sarah Koudelakos is the Executive Director and the Chief Operating Officer of the Canada-China Business Council. Gar Party, former Director General of Consular Affairs, and Daryl Bricker, Global Chief Executive Officer of Ipsos Public Affairs. And on our unpublished.vote question, 87% of our viewers and listeners, they want a rethink of that relationship. And Sarah, we'll start with you. How would you characterize the business relationship between Canada and China in the last 2 years?
So the business relationship between the two countries, if you go back to late 2018, was at the best it had been in a long time. But the political tensions, the detentions of Meng Wanzhou and the two Michaels, and the resulting strained political relationship has definitely put tension on that. And I look at the overall trade numbers, but I also look at our exports, because Canada's exports to China are really where the potential is. And they've definitely were impacted in 2019 and in early 2020 by COVID. They have started to recover in the last couple of months to levels resembling where they were in 2018. But it's a tough relationship, and how your business is doing in China depends very much on the sector that you're in.
Oh, really? So the political climate doesn't have much of an impact?
It does have an impact, but not on every sector. And a lot of Canadian companies are selling to Chinese consumers. So if they're buying beef or lobster or winter coats, that actually hasn't had as much of an impact as you might expect. If what you're selling requires intricate relationships government to government, then it's been a bit tougher. And where a lot of opportunity is in services, where it requires people going back and forth, travel has been impacted, first by the tensions, and now, of course, by COVID. And so in a nutshell, how your business might do in China depends very much on China's economic policy. Are you in a sector that's in demand either by the growth in consumption or by China's development plans?
Charles, how would you say the government has handled the China file so far in the last 2 years?
Well, I mean, considering that we've been subject to arbitrary violations of the canola seed contracts, the hostage diplomacy, and that our government has not made any more than rhetorical response to China's violations of the rules-based order, in particularly the genocide in northwest China against the Turkic Muslims, and the violation of the Sino-British Joint Declaration that Canada endorsed when it was lodged with the UN prior to the reversion of Hong Kong sovereignty to China. And in terms of pervasive cyber espionage that we have not responded to, the lack of our ability to control the sale of restricted technologies to agents of the Chinese state, pervasive cyber espionage inside Canada, and harassment of persons of Chinese origin who hold political opinions that the Chinese government doesn't, finds offensive to their overall interests, and our inability, I think, to consider legislation along the lines of the Australian Foreign Influence Transparency Scheme Act to try and allow for more transparency among persons in policy-making decisions in terms of their receipt of benefits from foreign states. All of these things are shortcomings of our government's approach, and really most unfortunate, because the less we do, the more it emboldens the Chinese government to hold on to Kovriken's favor, because this hostage diplomacy from their perspective is working. And in terms of not engaging in any reciprocal actions against China's violations of contracts for export of agricultural commodities on no valid basis whatsoever, we embolden them to do more of that. So I couldn't rate our government's response to China very highly. And for me, the real question is, why is it that our government doesn't defend the interests of Canada internationally in a way comparable to that's being done by countries that have a much higher, greater trade dependence on China, such as Australia?
Now, Daryl, your company, Ipsos, has taken a look at the situation. Canadians are paying attention to this, are they not?
Yeah, they very much are. And what we've seen is that as the level of interest in the relationship, the amount of activity that we're seeing in the news, for example, about China and Canada's relationship gets higher, what ends up happening is Canadian public opinion at this time tends to get lower. So Canadians are not very happy with the Chinese relationship, aren't trusting of the Chinese government at all, but they recognize that not having a trading relationship, a functioning trading relationship with China, is not a great thing for our country. So it's not something that we could sort of strike back at China and expect that there would be no consequences. So we actually have, I would say, in spite of what I usually hear from experts, where they say Canadians don't know anything about this, when you actually go out and you probe public opinion, Canadians actually have a fairly balanced perspective on this and a fairly sophisticated perspective. They believe that that China is not behaving appropriately, that Canada needs to do something about it, but by the same token, that when we do something about it, there could be consequences for our trading relationship.
And you talked to Canadians about how they thought the government was dealing with the issue. They was somewhat favorable?
Yeah, at least as favorable as just about anything else that they're doing right now. So Canadians, as I said before, are somewhat forgiving to the government on this, basically because they understand that it's complicated.
Gar Party, you have come out and said, Canada, pay the ransoms. Why are you saying that?
I say that. I think that's the only way that I think we can move forward. As long as this issue stays at the center of the table, all of the things that have been talked about so far, basically nothing gets changed. And so in effect, unless we solve this particular issue and solve it as quickly as we can, we are the government itself is a hostage to this particular situation. How we do it, most governments dealt with all of them in these kinds of issues over the years. Basically, you pay ransom. Every government in the world pays ransom of one sort or another. When you pay it is the only issue that really is up for negotiation. You do it, get it off the table so you can get back to some of the issues that we talked about earlier. As long as this stays, you're not going to get back to the other issues talked about.
Sarah, as the head of the Canada-China Business Council, it has to be difficult to try and conduct business when, obviously both sides politically are not exactly getting along. How do you do it?
Well, you do the best you can. Our members tell us, and they've told us ever since, the Hmong incident, that they feel like we're in the middle of a U.S.-China sandwich. And, the situation that we're in is not entirely of Canada's doing. And the U.S.-China tension has a lot of impact on companies. So an interesting thing we found in our survey earlier this year is that the U.S.-China trade war is one of is a significant factor in impact on business, mostly negative, not 100% though. If you're selling lobsters, actually you did very well last year because of U.S. Tariffs as a part of the trade war. But I think, the business community, they appreciate stability. They want to be able to predict what will happen. And this relationship has been very unpredictable. So some companies are saying, I'm not going to travel because I want to make sure that I am not, the next Michael. Others say, I don't want my product to be the next one hit by arbitrary tariffs or non-tariff barriers like canola. And so that level of uncertainty puts a dent in what was decent progress toward helping to diversify our trade relationship. You mentioned earlier about dependence on China. We are not dependent on China for our trade. Only 4% of our exports go to China. The U.S., which is in the middle of a fist-to-fist war with China, sends 8% of its exports to China. If we were simply to double our 4 to 8, it would add $25 billion to our economy. But it's tough to convince companies to make that grow when there is the uncertainty that exists.
Charles, America is the wild card in this, isn't it?
No, I wouldn't say so. I think that this is essentially the fault of China. The United States, made an extradition request in accordance with our treaty, based on, valid concerns that are being tested in the BC Superior Court. The idea that we're caught in a sandwich and that there's a moral equivalency between the two pieces of bread just isn't there. The United States is not engaged in anything like the kind of horrendous treatment, asymmetrical, unfair, and non-reciprocal treatment that we're getting from China. I think there's a general discomfort among Canadians with President Trump for very valid reasons, but the United States is not simply Trump. It's a democracy based on rule of law and balance between the judicial, the congressional, and the presidential branches, and therefore I really don't think that we should be focused on trying to dismiss our responsibility for addressing what China's been doing by sloughing it off on the United States. I just don't think that makes any rational sense, because the United States is our strongest trade partner and our best ally. Mm. And we share values with the United States. The United States does not have 1 million people in concentration camps. The United States has simply not been engaged in the kinds of gross violations of international law that we're seeing from China. So, I think that we have to deal with this as Canada to China, and it's Canada's responsibility to respond to defend our interests, and not simply, suggest that these things happen because there's a superpower rivalry between the United States and China.
Daryl, when we looked at your numbers and it was 8 and 10 wanted less trade with China, with this type of sentiment overwhelmingly against, how can politicians react when they have an electorate that says we don't want to deal with China anymore, but yet you still kind of you still want to do that? How do they sort of walk that tightrope?
Well, there's no easy way. I mean, the biggest issue here is making sure that people understand what it is that we're dealing with, and essentially trying to bring them in the room and educate them as to what the forces are that we're dealing with here, and particularly what the payoffs and the risks are. Just simply going out and sort of making a platitudinous statement and expecting Canadians are going to trust you in this current environment is not going to work. So Canadians, I think, to the extent that you treat them like adults, you speak to them plainly about what the facts are on this, and you really do effectively make your case, and you trust them with the facts, you have a potential to bring them along on some of these issues. But too often when it comes to the foreign policy world, I think that the general perception of our political leaders is that these things are too sophisticated to trust average Canadians with. I think they couldn't be more wrong on this. I don't see, for example, the idea that you'd be able to pay the ransom in China going over in any way politically in this country, unless somebody is prepared to really make a very strong case in public as to why this is the only way forward. The political consequences, particularly as we're moving into a potential election period, and quite frankly, we should be treating 2021 as a total election period. It's either going to be the election or it's going to be the run-up to the election. A very, very sensitive political issue like this will not go over well unless Canadians have a very good understanding of why it was the only way to deal with this particular issue.
Gar, when we look... Sure, okay, jump in.
If I might just add, we asked the business community about the Canadian government's strategy for China, and what if they understood what it was, if it was clear. And we heard from the majority of respondents that they had no idea what the Canadian government's strategy was. And it kind of aligns with Daryl's comment that, if people aren't assumed to be able to understand what's happening, maybe it just isn't voiced. And what we heard was they wanted the government to have a strategy. They were not unanimous in, we should be soft on China or we should be hard on China. They just wanted it to be clear.
Gar, with Canada in this situation with China, do we have allies that can step in, help out, support in some way or form?
Not of any value in terms of dealing with particular issues. If you look at, and I think we're looking at it to some extent without understanding the region in which all of this is taking place and the changes that have occurred back in China. If you go back to 1968, when we sat down and stopped and negotiate the relationship with China, the diplomatic relations with China. If you looked at China in terms of what was going on there, we were in the midst of the Cultural Revolution, and millions of Chinese were being killed or deported or exiled from the country and everything else. We are party to the emergence of China out of the chaos that was China for the longest period after the 1940 revolution. We've helped create the China that we have to deal with today. And to say that that the superpower relationship is not important. The Chinese have a very large objective. It's probably the first objective on their foreign policy agenda is to get the Americans out of Asia. That's basically what they're trying to do. They don't want they're coming on. They see themselves as the power in Asia, and they don't want foreigners. The Chinese, the other thing that they've done here, they work with time more than we do here. We work on small pieces of time here, basically election periods, and as a result of that, in effect, policy does not sustain itself over that kind of time in our system. So you've got to stand back from this sort of thing and look at it in a longer time frame. And the other thing to bear in mind here, various issues that are mentioned, the one that struck me is in terms of some of the supposedly the actions that China is taking against Canada on the soybean issue. Well, at the same time that they were cutting back in soybean, they increased their imports of oil. These kinds of things are going. The Chinese are not going to injure themselves in this kind of problem, but we can injure ourselves here if we're not very careful in terms of what goes on. So you've got to be very careful in what you can do. You take the issues that you can deal with. We can deal with the two Michaels. We can solve that issue very quickly. Get it off the agenda, and in effect, you can get back to dealing with some of the other issues here that other people are talking about. As long as it stays, you've got a problem.
You're watching Unpublished TV as we talk about the Canada-China relationship, which is deteriorating. And Charles Burton is joining us on the panel, a former counselor at the Canadian Embassy in Beijing. Sarah Koutoulakos, Executive Director of the Canada-China Business Council. Gar Pardy, you just heard from him, Director General of the Consular Affairs. And Daryl Bricker, Global Chief Executive Officer of Ipsos Public Affairs. And, let's go to Charles right now. And, do we know what China's ambitions are?
Oh, yes. I mean, in the October 2017 speech to the Chinese Communist Party's Congress, the Party General Secretary Xi Jinping made it very clear that China hopes to create a community of the common destiny of mankind, which is a new world order based on China's rise and the decline of the United States and replacement of the Western-dominated institutions like the WTO and the UN with China-based institutions buttressed by the Belt and Road Initiative, the massive global infrastructure project, which all the belts lead to China and all the roads lead to China. And so, from that point of view, there's a desire to redress the humiliation that the Chinese Communist Party focuses on after the Opium War of 1840, and for China to resume what is regarded as its historical place as the dominant civilization on the planet to which all other countries should be subordinate. And that's their plan. I don't think it's a feasible plan. I don't think the Belt and Road Initiative is going to fulfill its promise anytime soon. And I'm not expecting that we will all have to give up our liberal democratic ideals to authoritarian one-party state dominated global order. But that's certainly the way that China wants to see it. I would say in terms of challenging this, Canada has a couple of options. One being offering safe harbor to those people in Hong Kong who are at political risk. There are 900,000 Canadians who speak Cantonese, 600,000 of them here in Canada, 300,000 of them resident in Hong Kong. We should be protecting them. And secondly, I think the most effective measure would be to put Chinese officials who are culpable for gross violations of human rights onto the Magnitsky list that we have already. Officials of other countries, Saudi Arabia, Venezuela, Sudan, and so on that list. And that list has an impact because Mr. Xi, as we can see from the Meng Wanzhou case, needs to protect the elite element of his party. And if the Magnitsky list means that certain important people or representatives of important factions within the party cannot come to Canada and cannot access their resources here and cannot use Canada as a bolt hole against factional struggle, then that really does put pressure on him if he's seen by those elements as having mismanaged the relationship with China. And if you look at Ms. Meng alone, she has two large mansions in Vancouver, one worth $5 million, the other worth $13 million. When she was detained at the airport, she was found to be carrying 7 passports, and we have evidence of an 8th public purposes passport. People who, are not intending to seek refuge in our country don't carry, or somewhere out of China, have no need to carry multiple passports and maintain significant amounts of resources in safety abroad. So from that point of view, I do think that we have to take advantage of our knowledge of how the Chinese system works to exert the pressure that would lead to the release of Kovrikin's favor. And I think by not doing it, we embolden the Chinese regime to continue along this line of an asymmetrical relationship where they exploit Canada's weakness.
Daryl, we have a new conservative leader in Canada right now. I'm wondering, does that have any? Did you look at anything like that? Would that have any other impact on the relationship, or would that be something to maybe restart a relationship?
Well, it remains to be seen, but a new government could potentially have another impact. But I'd like to raise one more issue here, and it's one that when we get into these discussions about China, it always baffles me why it doesn't come up. But China is in a demographic death spiral right now. Their birth rate is 1.5. They're going to lose half of their population this century. Wow. They have the most rapidly aging large population in the world. While they may have a whole series of external ambitions, and we might like to be talking about them as though they are a population that's continuing to grow or is in some form of stability, they're not. They're in a situation that is going to be extremely challenging for that government in not a very long period of time. This is a country that has no national welfare programs, no old age pension programs, and they have the most rapidly aging old population on the planet. Wow, and those are just facts.
That's I had no idea about that. That really that puts it right into focus. Now,
and these are based on the numbers, by the way, that we can get. The situation is probably even worse.
Wow. Gar, and I'm going to have you try and get your mic unmuffled. It was a little muffled when we were talking earlier. When you're dealing with Canada and China in a relationship, I guess if you want to keep that relationship, you want to find common ground. How do you find common ground when you really don't get along with that other person? Gar? Hello, Gar.
Is that better sound?
There you go. That's a bit better.
Anyway, No, I just want to go back to a couple of things that Charles said there. I mean, he listed off a number of small sticks that can keep the Chinese up about, but it's not going to do anything in resolving anything in terms of what we're trying to deal with today. It's the fact that we've got 300,000 Canadians who live in Hong Kong. They've been living there now, I think, at least for 15, 20 years. Those are decisions made by Canadians, and they can come back anytime they want. If you're going to do what the Brits have just suggested here in terms of opening up, the Brits have a different responsibility to a large number of people who live in Hong Kong that are different. The British denied them citizenship at a time when they were giving citizenship to other people. And so you've got that kind of an issue. But I don't think that's going to solve any of our problems. If we put sanctions against the two individual leaders in China, that is not going to deal with the issue that we're dealing with right now. And to suggest that the Americans are not responsible for some of the issues that we have to deal with, I think we're just closing our eyes to the issues that are fundamental to what the Chinese are doing. And you asked me earlier about allies out there in the world here, the Chinese. We have no allies. The Chinese have been probably, in terms of having a foreign policy, have been one of the most successful, I think, in the history of the 20th century. They have reached out into the world, and there isn't a part of the world that the Chinese are not, in effect, welcome. You look at Africa as one of them, even in Latin America and the Caribbean, you get this sort of thing. The Middle East, the Chinese run probably the most successful foreign policy in the Middle East. It's essential for them to run a good policy, but they've got relations as good with Israel as they do with Saudi Arabia. And they exploit that. Europe has got a problem, but the Europeans right now, they're not going to rush to our aid in supporting us with any problems that we have with China. We have to solve our own problems. And if we don't solve them, they're going to get worse.
All right. Now, Sarah, I want to go back to what Daryl said about how much this population is aging in China. And, if you're, obviously you represent the Canada-China Business Council. If you want to go do business over there, was that new information to you? And does that change your tact?
No, it's not new information at all. And so, you talked about where you find common ground. Mm-hmm. Well, in the business community, we also think about, where are China's needs? And you see a lot of success of equipping people with insurance policies, life insurance policies, for example, because that social safety net hasn't been there. Our education system, which has 140,000 students each year from China that contribute billions of dollars to the Canadian economy, that's part of every Chinese family's goal of how do I make sure that my children can do better than I can. So there are lots of areas like that where you can find common ground. One of our members, which is a spin-off of a hospital in Manitoba, runs a series of, they call them the Canada Wellness Centers. And even in the midst of this bilateral tension, they have not changed their name. And they're focused on chronic disease prevention and care because the incidence of high blood pressure and diabetes and diseases like that are so prevalent. So, knowing that if China does fail, if it doesn't succeed in its economic development goals, not that we're going to take over the world kind of goals that Charles is talking about, but they've pulled 800 million people out of poverty, and the goal is to help keep people's salaries rising and their standards of living rising. So why wouldn't we want to take advantage of that now? And when we have high quality food and resources and other products where we can be a reliable supplier, we should be selling those now, particularly with a consumer population that's growing very quickly. But after that population falls off a cliff, the demand might not be there. We should be taking advantage of that now while the window is open.
What do you think, Charles?
Well, I think that the demographic issue is certainly there. Now that I'm over 65, the government of Yunnan has offered me a retiree's residence visa. I guess they want to bring in oldsters. That seems to be counterintuitive to what you've been saying. But no, I think that the demographic issue is there. As someone who was educated in China, most of my classmates have one child. And in the case of my demographic, a lot of those children are living abroad and are unable to provide the traditional Chinese family of the young supporting the old, leaving the old people at at loose ends economically, and I would say just in terms of their spiritual life. So, it is a regrettable factor. The one-child policy turns out to have been, they had for many years, from 1979 until quite recently, a highly restricted birth control policy, and it turns out that this policy is leading to unanticipated disastrous consequences, and really a sort of human tragedy for old people who are alone and without resources. So, I do think that is a factor. I'm not sure that Canada selling private insurance in China is the solution. I think the solution is in a country which is now among the most unfair in terms of distribution of wealth, your 86 US dollar billionaires in the National People's Congress and so on, that the Chinese government should be doing much more serious measures to transfer wealth from the wealthy to support the poor. And this is particularly a tragic situation in rural areas where a lot of the young people have left and are leaving behind old people, and the pensions that the government is offering are pathetically small and completely inadequate to them being able to sustain dignified and reliable lives where they have a sense of confidence and where they're able to receive medical treatment as they need it. So, I think that Darrell brings up a very important and fundamental point. I think that, as someone who lived in China when it was a Marxist period before opening and reform, when social justice and equality were the watchwords of the regime, I feel very disappointed that under the current regime, there does seem to be a lack of willingness to accommodate poverty alleviation and to make society more just.
Charles, we'll leave the last word with you. Folks, I want to thank you for joining us on Unpublished TV. Great conversation once again. Charles Burton, former counselor of the Canadian Embassy in Beijing. Sarah Koudelakos, Executive Director and the Chief Operating Officer of the Canada-China Business Council. Gar Party, former Director General of Consular Affairs. And Darrell Bricker, he is the Global Chief Executive Officer of Ipsos Public Affairs. And coming up on the next Unpublished TV, proroguing Parliament and whether it'll give the Grits a bit of a respite from the Wee scandal. I want to thank you for watching Unpublished TV. I'm Ed Hand. Stay safe.